In the quiet corners of history, there are stories not often told, stories shaped by human strength and human failure. This is one of those stories the accounts we share now reach back through time to reveal moments that changed the world. Let us begin by travelling into a past long forgotten yet still echoing into our present. In 1763, France held an empire spanning 5 continents. Yet merely 2 centuries later, that vast collection of territories had nearly disappeared, leaving only a few small islands and distant lands. The dramatic collapse of the French Empire stands as one of history's great tales of imperial decline. From the first voyage of Jacques Cartier in 1534 to the brutal Algerian War, ending in 1962, we will explore how France built the world's second largest colonial domain, controlling 8.6% of the planet's land, only to lose it in a chain of disastrous wars, revolutions and struggles for freedom that reshaped our modern era. While Spain and Portugal led early European expansion, France was eager to claim its portion of the New World's riches. In April 1534, the first major French expedition sailed as Jacques Cartier left Saint-Malo with 2 ships and about 60 men. King Francis I gave clear orders for this journey. Find gold, discover a route to Asia, and expand French power across the Atlantic, reaching the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Cartier found more than empty land. At Gaspe Bay, he met over 300 indigenous people from the region now called Quebec. This began a unique French way of engaging with native peoples. Unlike other Europeans who often used brute force, the French operated with smaller groups. This required more diplomacy with local populations. That first meeting set a pattern for generations of French colonial contact. When Cartier returned to France, he brought 2 sons of Chief Donnacona. They travelled not as prisoners, but as guests who would learn French and become interpreters. This cultural exchange, while flawed by today's standards, differed sharply from the violent methods of Spanish conquistadors. The next decades showed France would build empire differently than its rivals. While Spain sought precious metals through conquest and forced labour, French interests in North America turned to the fur trade. Beaver pelts became incredibly valuable in Europe, where they were made into fine hats and clothes for the wealthy. This trade shaped France's entire colonial plan. Instead of large settlements that displaced native people, the French built trading networks that relied on indigenous hunters and trappers. Independent French traders called coureurs des bois moved deep into the continent, often adopting native ways and forming family alliances through marriage. This eventually created the distinct Métis culture. Yet early French colonial dreams faced serious setbacks. A Huguenot attempt to build Fort Caroline in Florida in 1562 ended when Spanish forces killed almost all the colonists. Worse religious wars consumed France itself in the late 16th century, draining resources that could have supported colonies. Despite this, French contact with North America continued through seasonal settlements. Fishing fleets from Normandy and Brittany set up temporary bases in Newfoundland while traders kept small posts along the St. Lawrence. These humble starts hardly predicted the huge empire France would later control, but they gave crucial footholds on the continent. Not until 1627, with Cardinal Richelieu's company of 100 associates, did France seriously try to organise its colonial efforts in New France. Even then, the company struggled with money from the start, showing the difficulty of keeping colonies across such great distances. As the company faced financial trouble, a stronger base for French colonial dreams was forming far to the north. Unlike Spain's conquistadors who searched for cities of gold, French traders forged a different path to empire. One built on relationships more than conquest, where native knowledge mattered more than European military power. French colonial strategy shifted fundamentally around the turn of the 17th century. In 1600, Pierre Chauvin built a trading post at Tadoussac, where the Saguenay and St. Lawrence rivers meet. This marked France's first attempt at a year-round presence in North America. 8 years later, Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec, the settlement that would become the heart of New France. Champlain, now called the father of New France, understood that survival in this harsh land required working with indigenous peoples, not subduing them. What emerged was a uniquely French way of colonizing. Rather than focusing on farms with European settlers, New France grew around trading networks that reached far inland. At the centre of this economy was one animal, the beaver. European fashion created endless demand for beaver felt hats, making the pelts extremely valuable. A single high-quality beaver pelt could bring more than a month's wages for a French worker. The cleverness of the French approach lay in adapting to North American realities. With few soldiers and settlers, French colonial leaders built strategic alliances with the Huron and other native nations. These partnerships were strengthened through trade ceremonies and even intermarriage. French traders learned indigenous survival skills like canoe travel, snowshoe walking, and native hunting methods. Most remarkable were the coureurs des bois, the runners of the woods who lived beyond French settlements among indigenous peoples. These independent traders became cultural go-betweens, often learning native languages, adopting local customs, and sometimes taking indigenous wives. Though French authorities tried to control them, the coureurs des bois played a key role in spreading French influence through the Great Lakes and Mississippi Valley. Jesuit missionaries represented another distinct part of French colonization. Unlike Spanish missionaries who came with armies, Jesuit black robes set up missions in native villages. They learned local languages and recorded indigenous cultures even as they sought converts. Their detailed reports, called the Jesuit Relations, gave Europeans new insights into native societies while creating tension between traditional beliefs and Catholic teaching. Despite these innovations, New France suffered constant population shortages. While British colonies attracted thousands of settlers each year, few French immigrants arrived. By 1663, after over half a century of settlement, only about 3,000 Europeans lived in the colony. This weakness came from both the tough Canadian climate and strict French policies that limited immigration to Catholics of good standing, seeing both the promise and the problems of New France. King Louis XIV took direct control in 1663, making it a royal colony. The king sent the Carignan Salières Regiment, over 1,000 professional soldiers, to defend against Iroquois raids. He also appointed a royal governor and intendant to run the territory. This reorganisation began greater French investment in North America. While King Louis XIV strengthened France's position in North America, a far more profitable part of its colonial empire was growing thousands of miles away. In the warm Caribbean waters, France was building a colonial system so lucrative that one island would eventually earn more than all 13 British American colonies combined. Caribbean expansion started in 1635, when France claimed Guadeloupe and Martinique islands known for farming potential. Unlike the fur-based economy of New France, these tropical lands were developed for plantation agriculture, mainly sugar. The first settlements were organised by the Company of the American Islands, which had a royal charter to develop French interest there. By 1659, France had taken part of Saint-Domingue, modern Haiti, from Spain, beginning what would become the crown jewel of its colonial holdings. Within decades, this colony turned into an agricultural powerhouse through the brutal use of enslaved African labour. The plantation system needed huge numbers of workers, pulling France deep into the transatlantic slave trade. French ships carried millions of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic under horrific conditions to work these plantations. The economic results were staggering. By the 18th century, Saint-Domingue alone produced about 40% of Europe's sugar and 60% of its coffee. This single colony became the most profitable European possession in the Americas, outproducing entire mainland empires. Wealth, from these Caribbean lands flowed back to France, enriching merchant families in port cities like Nantes, Bordeaux and Marseille. To regulate the complex system of slavery, Louis XIV issued the Code Noir in 1685. This legal framework defined slavery in the French Empire, controlling every part of enslaved people's lives, while oddly giving some protections. The code required owners to provide food and clothing, banned certain punishments, and even let enslaved people report abuses to authorities. Yet these protections existed alongside brutal rules that treated enslaved people as property and ordered harsh penalties, including death for various offences. France's imperial vision reached beyond the Caribbean. In the Indian Ocean, France established a presence on Île Bourbon now, reunion in 1665, followed by settlements on Île-de-France, now Mauritius. These islands served as strategic bases for French ships going to and from India, while also developing their own plantation economies for spices, coffee and sugar. The East India Company, founded by Colbert in 1664, managed these operations from its base at Lorient. The growing French Empire inevitably clashed with other European powers. The wealthy sugar islands became frequent targets during wars, changing hands multiple times. Between France, Britain and the Netherlands, naval power grew crucial for defending these scattered lands, leading France to invest heavily in its fleet. The Caribbean colonies also hosted a thriving community of pirates and privateers. The island of Tortuga off Saint-Domingue became a notorious base for buccaneers who attacked Spanish ships. Many operated with quiet French approval through letters of marque, letting them raid enemy ships while giving a share of their loot to the French crown. This unofficial warfare strengthened France's position without needing direct military action. While the Caribbean became the crown jewel of France's Atlantic Empire, another imperial contest was unfolding across the globe in a region where France arrived quite late, the exotic markets of Asia. Here France faced strong opponents already settled in the area's lucrative trade networks. In 1664, Jean-Baptiste Colbert-Louis XIV's brilliant finance minister created the French East India Company. Its ambitious goal was to challenge the Portuguese, Dutch and British powers already influential across Asia. The company received royal support and huge financing of 15 million livres a fortune at the time, showing Louis XIV's drive to project French power worldwide. The French strategy differed much from their British rivals. While the British East India Company increasingly sought land, the French stressed commercial ties and diplomatic partnerships with local rulers. This approach came partly from necessity, arriving decades after competitors meant finding other ways into established markets. France's first major foothold came in 1674 when François Martin set up a trading post at Pondicherry on India's Coromandel coast. From this modest start, just a small strip of coast, Pondicherry grew into the administrative centre of French India. The settlement's distinct grid pattern and French architectural style remain visible in the city today, a lasting mark of this colonial encounter. The French slowly expanded their presence, building additional comptoirs, trading posts at key locations. Chandernagore in Bengal gave access to the rich textile markets of eastern India, while Mahé on the Malabar coast connected French merchants to the valuable pepper and spice trade. These settlements were carefully placed to tap existing trade routes, while avoiding direct fights with stronger European rivals. Unlike in the Caribbean, where France built slave-based plantation economies in India, the French mainly worked as merchants buying finished goods from local producers. The French East India Company traded in fine textiles like calico and muslin indigo, dye saltpeter for gunpowder spices and luxuries like diamonds from the famous Golconda mines. These goods brought high prices in European markets, enriching both the company and the French crown. the French worked to build relationships with Indian powers, especially the Mughal Empire and various regional kingdoms. In 1687, French envoys reached Emperor Aurangzeb's court, securing trading rights that strengthened their commercial position. These diplomatic efforts showed a smart understanding that in Asia, Europeans needed to negotiate, not just conquer French ambitions stretched beyond India to Southeast Asia. In 1680, the East India Company sent Pierre Poivre to Vietnam, starting contacts that would lead to later colonial projects. These early missions focused on trade and Catholic missionary work, not land control. Perhaps the most dramatic episode in early French Asian expansion happened in Siam, modern Thailand. In 1687, Louis XIV sent a bold embassy with over 600 soldiers to King Nare's court, hoping to win trade advantages and convert the king to Catholicism. This overreach sparked a nationalist backlash, leading to the 1688 Siamese Revolution. Anti-foreign groups executed pro-French officials, expelled the French military, and forced missionaries to flee. This humiliating setback showed the limits of French influence. In 1682, René, Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle finished an amazing journey that redrew the map of North America. After travelling the entire Mississippi River from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, La Salle held a dramatic ceremony at the river's delta. He raised a column, buried an engraved plate, and claimed for King Louis XIV a territory he named Louisiana, a vast inland empire stretching from the Appalachian Mountains to the Rocky Mountains. This huge land claim was a strategic masterstroke for French imperial dreams. By controlling the Mississippi watershed, France created a geographic grip around the British colonies, trapping them along the Atlantic coast. Louisiana became a crucial link between the fur trade of New France in the north and the plantation colonies of the Caribbean to the south. The territory covered nearly a third of what would become the continental United States, a landmass bigger than France itself. Unlike the crowded British colonies, French Louisiana stayed sparsely populated throughout its history. By 1708, fewer than 300 Europeans lived there, scattered in a handful of isolated trading posts. This thin settlement pattern reflected France's different colonial approach. Instead of sending many settlers, French authorities built a network of strategic forts and trading stations like Fort de Mississippi, Arkansas Post, and later Fort Orleans. These maintained land claims while developing trade with indigenous nations. Indigenous alliances proved essential to French control agreements, with the Choctaw Natchez, Illinois, and other nations secured French trade routes and provided key military support against British and Spanish moves. These partnerships, however, remained fragile and sometimes turned violent, as shown by the Natchez Revolt of 1729, which briefly destroyed French settlements in that area. Louisiana's economy first focused on the fur trade, especially deerskins and beaver pelts, but French leaders soon tried to diversify experimental plantations, grew tobacco, indigo, and later sugar. Though these struggled compared to Caribbean ones, the colony's tough conditions, including frequent floods, tropical diseases and Gulf Coast hurricanes, discouraged settlers and complicated farming. In 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht redrew North America's imperial borders, forcing France to give territories in Newfoundland and Acadia to Britain. This diplomatic loss raised Louisiana's strategic importance as a buffer against British growth. 5 years later, in 1718, the French founded New Orleans as Louisiana's new capital. Its location was carefully chosen to control access to the Mississippi River system and serve as an administrative and military center for the whole territory. The city's founding showed France's determination to keep its continental claims, despite limited resources and competing imperial priorities. Yet Louisiana remained chronically short of money and people throughout the French period. The financial strain grew so severe that in 1717 the French crown handed the colony's management to John Law's Company of the West, later the Company of the Indies, hoping private business might succeed where the state had struggled. While Louisiana struggled under private control, a far greater challenge was building across the Atlantic, one that would shake the foundations of France's entire colonial project. What happens when the world's most powerful monarch gambles his empire on a Spanish inheritance and loses nearly everything in the process? In 1700, the death of King Charles II of Spain sparked a succession crisis that reshaped European politics and colonial lands for generations. The childless Spanish king had named Philip of Anjou, Louis XIV's grandson, as his heir, potentially joining the French and Spanish thrones under Bourbon family control. This possibility alarmed other European powers who feared a French-Spanish superpower dominating Europe and the Americas. Britain, the Dutch Republic. Austria and several German states formed the Grand Alliance to prevent this outcome. Starting the War of Spanish Succession in 1701, the conflict spread across Europe and into colonial territories, turning a European dynastic dispute into the first truly global war. France fought on multiple fronts with shrinking resources and growing casualties. The war proved disastrous for French imperial dreams. While Louis XIV's army battled desperately in Europe, Britain's growing naval power let it strike directly at French colonial lands. French settlements in the Caribbean became especially vulnerable, with Britain taking St. Kitts in 1702. In North America, British forces captured the key fortress of Port Royal in Acadia in 1710, gaining control over the entrance to the St. Lawrence River, the lifeline of New France. By 1712, the exhausted French state neared financial collapse. Military costs had ruined the treasury, while crop failures and trade disruptions caused domestic hardship. Louis XIV, now in his 70s, and having seen his son and eldest grandson die during the war, reluctantly accepted peace terms that sharply cut French power. The 1713 Treaty of Utrecht forced France to give up significant territories, including Hudson Bay, Newfoundland, and Acadia, renamed Nova Scotia, to Britain. These losses critically weakened New France's defences, leaving Quebec open to future British attacks. In the Caribbean, France gave up its claims to St. Kitts, but kept its valuable Sugar Islands, Guadeloupe, and Martinique. The treaty let Philip V stay on the Spanish throne, but only after he renounced all claims to the French crown. More importantly, Spain and France were explicitly forbidden from uniting their empires with rules, requiring the two Bourbon monarchies must always stay separate. This separation blocked France from accessing Spain's vast American silver wealth, which might have restored French finances. Britain emerged the clear winner, gaining not only French lands, but also the asiento, a valuable contract to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies. With new naval bases and trading rights, this marked Britain's rise as the dominant Atlantic power, fundamentally changing the colonial balance. The world was about to see a conflict unlike any before. While earlier wars were mostly limited to single continents, the 7 Years' War erupted in 1756 as the first truly global fight, with battlefields from North American forests to Indian plains. This was not just a European power struggle, but a fight for global dominance that would permanently reshape the colonial landscape for France. The stakes could not have been higher. Under Louis XV, the French Empire had somewhat recovered from the setbacks of the War of Spanish Succession, but tensions with Britain had simmered for years, especially in the contested Ohio Valley, where both powers sought to expand. When a young George Washington led Virginia militia against French forces at Fort Duquesne in 1754, he unknowingly lit the fuse of a global powder keg. The war quickly spread beyond North America and Europe. Traditional alliances broke in what historians call the diplomatic revolution, with France joining its old enemy Austria against Prussia and Great Britain. Meanwhile, far from European shores, British and French forces clashed across India, Africa and the Caribbean. For the first time, military planners had to think about strategy on a truly global scale. In North America, the tide first favoured France-French forces, and their native allies won several early victories using superior woodland tactics against British regulars unused to frontier fighting. But the war's momentum changed dramatically after William Pitt became Britain's war minister in 1757. Pitt saw the global nature of the conflict and committed unmatched resources to winning in North America. The results devastated French ambitions. In September 1759, British forces under General James Wolfe captured Quebec in a daring climb up cliffs to the Plains of Abraham. Though both Wolfe and his French counterpart Montcalm died in the battle, the loss of Quebec dealt a death blow to New France. Montreal fell the next year, effectively ending France's century-and-a-half presence in Canada. Across the globe in India, the pattern repeated Robert Clive's victory at Plassey in 1757 over French-supported local forces secured British dominance in Bengal. This win was not just military. It gave Britain control over one of India's richest regions and reduced France to a minor colonial player on the subcontinent. Even in the Caribbean, where France kept its valuable sugar islands, British naval power proved decisive. Guadeloupe fell in 1759, followed by Martinique in 1762. Though immensely valuable for sugar production, these islands would be returned to France in the final peace, a controversial decision in Britain. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 formalised France's imperial collapse. The terms were harsh. France gave Canada and all lands east of the Mississippi to Britain to repay their Spanish allies who joined the war. Late France transferred Louisiana west of the Mississippi to Spain. French holdings in India shrank to a few trading posts. Only in the Caribbean did France keep major colonies with Britain, returning Martinique and Guadeloupe in exchange for Canada, a trade many in Britain questioned given the sugar islands' greater economic value. The world was about to witness a conflict unlike any before. While France's overseas territories had been divided by foreign powers from the ashes of imperial defeat, would rise something far more threatening to the established order. The French Revolution that began in 1789 with calls for liberty, equality and fraternity eventually created the conditions for one of history's most ambitious military dictators to build a new French empire. By 1799, a decade of revolutionary chaos had exhausted France. The Directory, a 5-member committee ruling the nation, faced financial crisis, military failures and widespread public unhappiness. Into this power vacuum stepped a 30-year-old military commander whose fame had been made on battlefields across Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte, already celebrated for his brilliant Italian campaign of 1796 to 1797, took power through a carefully planned coup d'etat on November 9th and 10th, 1799. Napoleon's path to power began on the Mediterranean island of Corsica, which France had annexed just a year before his birth in 1769. His military education and tactical skill lifted him through the ranks during the revolutionary years. By 1798, aiming to strike British interests and build his own legend, Napoleon led a bold expedition to Egypt. While the campaign ultimately failed militarily, it produced major scientific and cultural results, including finding the Rosetta Stone, a triple language inscription that would later let scholars read ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. As first consul of France, Napoleon moved fast to secure power and rebuild a nation broken by revolution. His administrative reforms created a centralised government with prefects appointed to manage departments across France. The Napoleonic Code of 1804 standardised French law, embedding revolutionary ideas like equality before the law while keeping patriarchal authority in families. This legal framework would influence law across Europe and the Americas. Napoleon's practical approach to rule showed in his religious policy. The Concordat of 1801 with Pope Pius VII healed the decade-long split between revolutionary France and the Catholic Church. While recognizing Catholicism as the religion of most French citizens, the agreement kept state control over church, appointments and religious practice. This calculated compromise restored stability, while stopping the church from regaining its pre-revolutionary influence. Even as Napoleon restored order in France, the empire faced major colonial challenges. In Saint-Domingue, formerly France's richest colony, enslaved people had seized the revolutionary promise of equality and started their own fight for freedom. Under Toussaint Louverture, a formerly enslaved man who became a brilliant military and political strategist, the revolution survived repeated French attempts to regain control. Napoleon first sent 20,000 troops under his brother-in-law General Leclerc to retake the colony and restore slavery, but disease and fierce resistance devastated French forces. The failure in Saint-Domingue directly influenced Napoleon's next big colonial decision. In 1803, he sold the huge Louisiana territory to the United States for 60 million francs, about $15 million, effectively doubling the size of the young American Republic. This practical move let Napoleon focus on European conquest, while denying Britain a potential foothold in North America. Thomas Jefferson's negotiators originally sent to buy just New Orleans west, and when offered the whole territory from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. The world saw a dramatic shift when Napoleon Bonaparte, having taken control of France through his coup, set his sights on something far greater. With Louisiana assault and colonial dreams redirected, Napoleon turned toward a transformation that would shock Europe. What kind of military commander crowns himself sovereign? On December 2nd, 1804, Notre Dame Cathedral became the stage for an unprecedented spectacle. As Pope Pius VII held the crown during the coronation, Napoleon took it from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head before crowning his wife Josephine. This bold act showed his authority came not from God or church but from himself alone. The gesture was not just theatrical, it marked the final change of revolutionary France into an imperial power with Napoleon as its absolute ruler. The coronation ceremony deliberately recalled Charlemagne and Roman emperors, with Napoleon dressed in purple velvet robes embroidered with golden bees. The artist Jacques-Louis David captured the moment in a massive painting that showed the event not as it happened, but as Napoleon wanted it remembered, with his mother prominently shown though she had refused to attend. Beyond symbols, Napoleon secured power through institutional reforms. His administration reorganized France's education system, creating lycées that trained future civil servants loyal to the regime. He made a new aristocracy based on merit, not birth, giving titles like Duke, Count and Baron to military officers and civil administrators who served the empire exceptionally. Napoleon's family became tools of his expanding power across Europe. His brother Joseph was made King of Naples in 1806, later becoming King of Spain. Louis became King of Holland and Jerome was made King of Westphalia. His stepson Eugene de Beauharnais governed as Viceroy of Italy, while his sister Caroline and her husband Joachim Murat eventually ruled Naples. This Bonaparte dynasty spread French influence across the continent more effectively than armies alone could. Behind imperial splendor, Napoleon kept tight control over information and opposition. His regime used hundreds of censors who reviewed newspapers, books and plays. The secret police under Joseph Fouché watched potential dissenters, while infamous administrative detention allowed imprisonment without trial for those seen as threats to state security. When General Jean Moreau, once Napoleon's rival for power, was linked to a royalist plot in 1804 for his public trial and exile, showed the cost of opposing the emperor. The empire's machinery demanded unmatched resources. Conscription pulled hundreds of thousands of young Frenchmen into military service, with annual drafts rising from 30,000 to over 150,000 men during the imperial years. New taxes on salt, tobacco and Alcoholic drinks funded military campaigns, while the continental system, Napoleon's bold blockade against British raid, disrupted Europe's economy and daily life. Throughout this time of political change, French culture and science flourished under imperial support. The Egyptian campaign had sparked scientific interest that continued under the empire, with government funding for research in chemistry, mathematics and engineering. In 1800, for Joseph Nicephore Reynie P.C., he began tests with light-sensitive materials that would eventually lead to photography, though the first permanent photograph would not appear until 1826. Unable to beat Britain on the seas, Napoleon Bonaparte turned to a different kind of war in 1806. Through the Berlin Decree, he formalized the continental system, a grand economic plan to choke the British economy by cutting its trade with Europe. This unprecedented economic blockade required every nation under French influence to close ports to British ships and ban British goods from their markets. Napoleon believed this commercial isolation would collapse Britain's economy, forcing surrender without firing a shot. The continental system needed total European compliance to work, pushing Napoleon to extend French control along the continent's coastlines. What began as economic policy soon became the engine behind more military campaigns. The emperor needed to seal every possible smuggling route and close every harbour that might welcome British merchants. This bold strategy redrew the map of Europe as French forces marched into Italy, Germany, Holland and the Dalmatian coast. Britain's initial economic pain was real. Exports fell by a quarter as warehouses filled with unsold goods, sparking worker protests in manufacturing areas. But the British government responded with counter-blockades through orders in council, effectively saying neutral ships trading with French-controlled ports would be seized. Meanwhile, British merchants quickly adapted, creating elaborate smuggling networks and rerouting trade through neutral middlemen. The great irony of the continental system was how it hurt France's own prosperity. French manufacturers lost access to raw materials, colonial goods became very expensive, and port cities, once thriving on international trade, saw their harbors empty. In Hamburg, Bremen and Amsterdam, once busy trading hubs, Fils Island, the sea commerce died. When coffee prices rose tenfold in Paris, desperate merchants sold chicory root as a substitute, a practice that continues in some places today. Napoleon's attempts to enforce the blockade angered his allies and subjects. Dutch merchants, Spanish raiders and German burghers, who built their lives on commerce, now faced ruin under French economic rules. These hardships planted seeds of resentment that would later grow into resistance. The continental system grew harder to maintain as smuggling flourished. Along Europe's long coastlines, British goods reached continental markets disguised as Swedish, Russian, or American products, while corrupt officials often looked away for the right price. The system's enforcement caused diplomatic crises with nations that did not comply. Portugal's refusal to close its ports to British trade triggered the French invasion of 1807, pulling Napoleon into the Spanish quagmire that would become his Spanish ulcer. More seriously, Russia's gradual withdrawal from the system by 1811 set the stage for Napoleon's disastrous 1812 invasion. While the continental system failed to defeat Britain, it sparked unexpected results across the Atlantic. The United States, caught between British and French trade restrictions, turned inward. American textile mills, iron works and factories appeared as European imports became unavailable. This unintended boost to American industry ultimately strengthened the young republic that would later emerge as a global power. While Napoleon's economic war against Britain stumbled, his ambitions in Spain would become his worst mistake. In 1808, Napoleon's dynastic dreams led him to remove the Spanish Bourbon monarchy and put his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne. This political move, which seemed a simple extension of his family empire, ignited an unprecedented popular uprising that drained French imperial resources for years. Spanish resistance began dramatically on May 2, 1808, when Madrid citizens rose against French occupation rule. The French response was brutal mass executions of civilians that, instead of crushing resistance, turned scattered protests into a nationwide rebellion. What Napoleon expected to be a straightforward land grab became what historians call his Spanish ulcer wound that kept draining French strength and resources. The Spanish people's resistance introduced a new kind of war the French military was unprepared to face. Local fighters and small bands across mountainous terrain hit French supply lines, isolated garrisons, and communication networks. These tactics gave birth to the term guerrilla, meaning little war in Spanish, reflecting the popular nature of the resistance. Unlike regular armies, these fighters blended with civilians, making it hard for French forces to tell friend from foe. The conflict's intensity was unmatched. Civilians from all social classes joined the struggle against French occupation, turning conventional war into a people's war. Spanish fighters ambushed French patrols, destroyed bridges, intercepted messages, and killed collaborators. The French replied with collective punishment, executing suspected guerrillas and burning villages, which only deepened Spanish hatred and determination to drive out the invaders. British help proved crucial to Spanish resistance. Sir Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, landed in Portugal with British forces to support Spanish and Portuguese fighters. While guerrillas disrupted French operations, Wellington's regular forces fought the French in set battles, creating a two-front war that stretched Napoleon's military capacity. Napoleon himself saw the growing threat and personally led a campaign into Spain in late 1808 with 200,000 troops. He won several victories, but had to leave to face Austrian threats elsewhere, leaving his generals to continue a war becoming increasingly unwinnable. The emperor's absence let the insurgency come back stronger. The Catholic Church became a powerful force for resistance, framing the struggle as a religious war against French godlessness. Priests stirred anti-French feeling, painting Napoleon as an enemy of Catholicism and the occupation as an attack on Spanish religious traditions. This religious layer turned the conflict from a political fight into a sacred duty for many Spaniards. By 1812, over 300,000 French troops, a third of Napoleon's entire military, were stuck in Spain, forces badly needed elsewhere as European powers united against French dominance. The conflict brutality inspired Francisco Goya's haunting pictures of war's horrors, especially his famous painting The 3rd of May 1808, which captured the terror of French reprisals against Spanish civilians. With a third of his military trapped in the Spanish quagmire, Napoleon still looked east to Russia in 1812. The campaign that followed would turn the Grand Army from history's most formidable foe into frozen corpses scattered across the Russian steppe. A disaster so complete that of the 680,000 soldiers who proudly crossed the Niemen River on June 24th, fewer than 100,000 returned. At this conflict's heart was Russia's withdrawal from the continental system, threatening Napoleon's economic strategy against Britain. When diplomacy failed, Napoleon gathered the largest military force Europe had ever seen. A multinational army of French, Polish, Italian, German, and other European troops. The sheer logistics of moving and feeding such a huge force proved nearly impossible across Russia's vast landscape. From the campaign's start, Russian commanders Barclay de Tolly and later Kutuzov used a brilliantly simple plan: keep retreating while destroying anything valuable. As Napoleon's forces pushed deeper into Russia, they found burned villages, poisoned wells, and torched grain fields. The Russians sacrificed their own resources to deny them to the invaders, drawing the French into a lengthening supply line through increasingly barren land. On September 7th, 1812, the two armies finally clashed at the Battle of Borodino, a huge fight that left about 70,000 casualties in a single day. Though technically a French victory, the battle brought no strategic breakthrough. The Russians simply withdrew in good order. On September 14th, Napoleon entered Moscow to find a strangely empty city. Within hours, Moscow burst into flames, whether set deliberately by Russian authorities or accidentally by looters. The fire burned nearly 2/3 of the city over for days. Napoleon found himself holding a charred empty prize. With winter coming, he waited in Moscow for 5 critical weeks, hoping Tsar Alexander would negotiate. The Tsar never replied. By October 19th, facing shrinking supplies and the first frost, Napoleon ordered the retreat that would destroy his army. His soldiers who had marched into Russia in summer uniforms now faced temperatures dropping to minus 30 degrees Celsius. The retreat quickly became a nightmare of unimaginable scale. Soldiers froze to death standing at their posts. Others stripped clothes from the dead to survive another day. Supply wagons were abandoned as horses fell from hunger. Starving men ate their mounts raw. Russian forces under generals Gustavus Plato V and Milo Radovic constantly harassed the retreating columns. Cossack cavalry swooped on stragglers, while Russian partisans ambushed isolated units. At the Beriz, in a river crossing in late November, thousands drowned or froze trying to escape pursuing Russians. By December, the once magnificent Grand Army had broken into small bands of frozen, starving men struggling west. The scale of the disaster changed European politics. Prussia, long a reluctant French ally, switched sides in February 1813. Austria and Sweden soon joined what became the Sixth Coalition against Napoleon. With his army shattered, Napoleon hastily raised new forces, mostly inexperienced conscripts. Despite several tactical wins, in spring 1813 the coalition's numerical advantage proved overwhelming. The decisive fight came at Leipzig in October 1813, aptly called the Battle of the Nations, as it pitched French forces against Russians, Prussians, Austrians and Swedes. After 4 days of fighting, Napoleon's army suffered a crushing defeat, forcing a retreat to France itself. By March 1814, coalition forces entered Paris, and on April 6, Napoleon was forced to abdicate. Napoleon's abdication seemed to close the book on French imperial dreams, but less than a year later the impossible happened. On February 26, 1815, the deposed emperor slipped away from his Mediterranean exile on Elba with just 1,000 loyal followers. When he landed on southern France's coast on March 1st, his daring gamble began. Either a triumphant return or a quick execution as a traitor. What followed defied all expectation. As Napoleon marched north toward Paris, something remarkable occurred. Instead of arresting him, as ordered, regiment after regiment of the regular French army switched sides. Emotional scenes unfolded as soldiers who once fought under Napoleon's banner recognized their former commander. Many troops sent to capture him instead broke ranks, shouting "Vive l'Empereur" and pledging fresh loyalty to the man they had followed across Europe. The march to Paris became less a military campaign than a procession. Louis XVIII, restored to the throne after Napoleon's first abdication, saw the changing tide. By March 20th, just 3 weeks after landing, Napoleon entered Paris in triumph as the king fled to Belgium. Without firing a shot, the former exile had reclaimed one of Europe's most powerful thrones through sheer force of personality. Europe's reaction was swift and absolute. The great powers meeting at the Congress of Vienna, still redrawing Europe's map, after the Napoleonic Wars, immediately declared Napoleon an outlaw. Britain, Prussia, Austria and Russia formed the Seventh Coalition, mobilizing armies to remove the returned emperor permanently. They would accept nothing less than his complete removal from the European stage. Napoleon knew diplomatic solutions were impossible. His only hope lay in quick military action before coalition armies could combine against him. By June 1815, he had gathered a remarkable force of 125,000 men, showing his organizational genius, and moved into Belgium with a clear plan: defeat the British and Prussian armies separately before they could join. The critical confrontation came on June 18, 1815, with the small Belgian village of Waterloo. Napoleon's 72,000 troops faced Wellington's allied force of 68,000 men. The French emperor had reason for confidence. He outnumbered his immediate opponent and had beaten both Wellington and Blucher separately before, but fate and weather interfered. Heavy rains the previous night turned the battlefield to mud, delaying Napoleon's attack and giving Prussian forces crucial extra hours to march to Wellington's aid. The battle itself unfolded as a series of bloody clashes. Napoleon's opening artillery barrage proved less effective than planned because of the wet ground. His infantry attacks against Wellington's centre were repeatedly pushed back. When French cavalry charged British squares, they could not break the disciplined Allied formations. As the afternoon wore on, Napoleon committed his elite Imperial Guard soldiers, who had never known defeat, in a final desperate assault. The arrival of Prussian reinforcements under General Blücher proved decisive. Caught between Wellington's forces and the Prussian flanking attack, Napoleon's army collapsed. The catastrophic defeat caused about 25,000 French casualties and 8,000 captured. Napoleon's gamble had failed, completely ending his rule after just 100 days. The results were immediate and permanent. Napoleon abdicated a second time, and this time there would be no return. The British took him to the remote South Atlantic island, a volcanic rock thousands of miles from Europe, where he would stay until his death in 1821. When Napoleon died in 1821, the Bonaparte dynasty seemed finished forever. Yet history often gives unexpected sequels. 31 years later, his nephew Louis Napoleon Bonaparte achieved what many thought impossible, reviving the French Empire from the ashes of revolution and monarchy. The path to this second empire began with Louis Napoleon winning France's first presidential election in December 1848 with a huge 74% of the vote. As the new president of the Second Republic, he presented himself as a figure of stability during social and political turmoil, but his ambitions reached far beyond the 4-year term set by the Constitution. Facing the legal impossibility of running again, Louis Napoleon executed a bold coup d'état on December 2, 1851, exactly 47 years after his uncle's coronation. He dissolved the National Assembly and arrested potential opponents in a single night. With opposition neutralized, he called a plebiscite to approve a new constitution extending his presidential term to 10 years. This move proved very successful, setting the stage for his final change into emperor. 1 year later, on December 2nd, 1850, Louis Napoleon formally proclaimed the Second French Empire with himself as Emperor Napoleon III, honoring both his uncle and a short-lived son who never actually ruled. The quick shift from republic to empire showed the lasting appeal of the Bonaparte name and the French public's willingness to trade democratic principles for promises of stability and national greatness. Unlike his military focal, Napoleon III's vision for France centered on economic development and urban modernization. He launched an unmatched reconstruction of Paris under Baron Haussmann, replacing medieval neighborhoods with wide boulevards, parks, and modern infrastructure. These grand avenues served many purposes, improving public health, showing imperial splendor, and letting troops move fast to crush possible rebellions. The emperor embraced industrial development with remarkable enthusiasm. Railways expanded greatly under his rule, while new banks provided crucial financing for factories and businesses. This economic liberalism created a strange hybrid system, an authoritarian empire driving capitalist growth and middle-class prosperity. In colonial affairs, Napoleon III pursued what historians call a peace empire, focusing on economic investment and diplomatic ties rather than pure military conquest. He solidified French control in Algeria, partly conquered in 1830, and expanded French influence in Senegal and other parts of West Africa. His approach stressed what he called imperial responsibility, seeing French colonialism as a civilizing mission that would spread French values worldwide. This emerging colonial vision marked a basic shift from his uncle's Europe-focused conquests. While Napoleon I sold Louisiana and abandoned Haiti, Napoleon III actively sought new lands in Africa and Asia, laying the foundation for France's second colonial empire that would keep growing even after his own fall. Despite his focus on economic development and diplomacy, Napoleon III did not entirely abandon military adventures. His eventual role in the Crimean War 1853 to 1856 showed his desire to restore France's place as a major European power. But it also revealed a more cooperative approach through alliance with Britain, France's traditional enemy. This alliance with Britain, once unthinkable, signaled how far Napoleon III would go to restore French prestige after decades of post-Waterloo shame. When Russian troops invaded Ottoman lands in 1853, Napoleon III saw not a distant conflict, but the perfect chance to rewrite France's place in the world order through blood, innovation, and a war unlike any before. The conflict began with a seemingly small religious dispute over who would control Christian holy sites in Jerusalem. While Russia claimed protection rights over Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire, France asserted similar privileges for Catholics. This diplomatic tension grew when Tsar Nicholas I sent troops into Ottoman territories along the Danube, prompting the Sultan to declare war. Napoleon III, sensing a chance to check Russian expansion and demonstrate French power, quickly allied with Britain, France's old rival. What followed transformed warfare itself. When Allied forces landed in Crimea in September 1850, for they brought revolutionary technologies never before seen in combat. Telegraph lines sent battle reports across Europe within hours, while photographers like Roger Fenton captured haunting war images for civilian audiences. Railways moved supplies and wounded soldiers, while new explosive shells and rifled muskets caused unmatched casualties. The centerpiece of the conflict became the 11 months siege of Sevastopol, where French engineering and military skill proved decisive. French sappers dug elaborate trench systems, while their artillery smashed Russian fortifications with devastating effect. By September 1855, when Russian forces finally left the smoking ruins of Sevastopol, French military prestige had been dramatically restored through battlefield achievements Napoleon Bonaparte himself would have admired. Yet glory came at a terrible cost. Disease ravaged Allied camps with cholera and typh, killing more soldiers than enemy fire. These conditions spurred medical innovations that would change health care forever. While Florence Nightingale revolutionized British military nursing, French nursing sisters like Sue Rosalie Randou made similar reforms in French field hospitals. The Sisters of Charity set new standards for battlefield care that would influence military medicine for generations. The diplomatic triumph came in March 1856, when European powers gathered in Paris for peace talks. Napoleon III himself presided over the conference, a powerful symbol of France's return to diplomatic leadership. The resulting Treaty of Paris severely limited Russian naval power in the Black Sea and reduced Russian influence in the Ottoman Empire, establishing the principle of Ottoman territorial integrity under great power guarantee. For the first time since Waterloo, France had dictated terms to a major European power. The aftermath changed French imperial ambitions with renewed military confidence. France sped up colonial projects worldwide. Napoleon III deepened involvement in Algeria, expanded presence in Senegal, and set up a protectorate in Cambodia. The victory over Russia gave both the confidence and international prestige needed to pursue these far-flung ventures without serious European opposition. Perhaps most importantly, the war changed Anglo-French relations. Former enemies became allies, cooperating militarily against a common threat. This new understanding would reshape colonial competition as both powers increasingly coordinated imperial ambitions rather than directly confronting each other. The precedent of cooperation set in Crimean trenches would influence European diplomacy for decades. The diplomatic triumph in Crimea emboldened Napoleon III to attempt his most disastrous imperial gamble. In Mexico, France would try something no European power had dared since American independence, establishing a new monarchy in the Western Hemisphere, directly challenging the Monroe Doctrine that had kept European powers away for decades. The chance came in 1861, when Mexico under President Benito Juarez stopped payments on its foreign debts. What began as seemingly simple debt collection soon revealed Napoleon III's true ambitions. While Britain and Spain joined the first expedition, they quickly withdrew once they realized France's real goal was not financial compensation, but land conquest. Napoleon III imagined a French-ruled empire that would counter growing American influence and give access to Mexican silver mines. The French invasion met unexpected resistance almost immediately. On May 5, 1862, at the Battle of Puebla, Mexican forces won a stunning victory against the French army. Though ultimately just a temporary setback for France, this battle, remembered today as Cinco de Mayo, became a powerful symbol of Mexican resistance and national pride. The French advance slowed but did not stop, and by June 1863 French forces took Mexico City. With military controls set in central Mexico, Napoleon III moved forward with his grand imperial design. He chose Archduke Maximilian of Austria, a Habsburg prince with liberal views, as the new emperor of Mexico. Maximilian arrived in 1864 with his ambitious wife Charlotte, called Carlota, in Mexico, convinced they would be welcomed as modernizing rulers who could stabilize the wart or nation. Reality proved very different. Outside major cities, where SS Republican forces held significant territory, especially in the north, French troops, eventually about 40,000, found themselves in an increasingly costly occupation against determined resistance. Mexican guerrilla fighters used tactics like most Spanish forces used against Napoleon, the first hitting French supply lines and isolating garrisons. The situation worsened further for France when the American Civil War ended in 1865. The United States, now able to focus on affairs, began giving diplomatic support and weapons to Juarez's government. American officials clearly opposed European monarchies in the Western Hemisphere, putting diplomatic pressure on France while positioning troops along the Rio Grande as a not-so-subtle warning. By 1866, the Mexican adventure had become a strategic and financial disaster for Napoleon III. The occupation cost France about 50 million francs yearly, with no end in sight. Domestic criticism grew as French casualties rose and international isolation increased. Facing these realities, Napoleon III ordered a phased withdrawal of French troops. Despite knowing this would doom Maximilian's regime, Maximilian refused to leave his adopted country even as French forces departed. His loyalty proved fatal. Republican forces captured him in May 1867, and despite international pleas for mercy, Maximilian faced a firing squad on June 19, 1867. The execution, shown in Edouard Manet's famous paintings, shocked European royal houses and symbolized the catastrophic failure of Napoleon III's imperial vision. While Maximilian's execution marked a humiliating end to French dreams in Mexico, it would pale next to what followed. In 1870, a single edited telegram would trigger events that not only destroyed Napoleon III's empire, but rid Europe's map for generations. The crisis began innocently, with a diplomatic dispute over the Spanish throne. When Prince Leopold of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen emerged as a candidate, Napoleon III objected to having Prussian royalty on both French borders. The seemingly minor diplomatic matter became the perfect trap set by Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who long wanted a pretext for war with France to complete German unification under Prussian leadership. The turning point came when Bismarck received a telegram describing a polite but ordinary meeting between King Wilhelm I of Prussia and the French ambassador. Seeing a chance, Bismarck edited the telegram to make it seem the king had insulted France. When published, this E.M.S. telegram ignited French public outrage. On July 19, 1870, Napoleon III, hoping to restore his fading popularity with a quick military win, declared war on Prussia, walking straight into Bismarck's trap. What followed was a stunning military catastrophe. The French military, still trading on its Crimean War reputation, was no match for Prussia's modern war machine. Behind the scenes, the Prussian military had undergone revolutionary change. Field Marshal Helmuth von Moltke had developed a sophisticated general staff system, standardized mobilization plans, master drill way used for troop movements. Prussia could deploy troops 3 times faster than the French, using detailed timetables, specifying exactly which units would board specific trains at precise time. Meanwhile, the French military struggled with basic logistics. Soldiers reached front-line positions without proper supplies. Some units lacked maps of their own territory. Communication breakdowns led to conflicting orders and mischances. The technological gap was equally stark. Prussia's Krupp steel breech-loading cannons outranged French bronze artillery, letting Prussian forces bombard French positions while staying safely out of range. The decisive moment came at Sedan on September 1st and 2nd, 1870. The French army of Chalons, 130,000 men, including the Emperor himself, found itself surrounded by Prussian forces in a valley near the Belgian border. After a day of devastating artillery fire, Napoleon III faced the unthinkable surrender. On September 2nd, he personally surrendered to King Wilhelm I, becoming the first French head of state captured in battle since King Francis I was taken by the Holy Roman Emperor at Pavia in 1525. News of Napoleon's capture triggered immediate revolt in Paris. On September 4th, crowds stormed government buildings and the Third Republic was proclaimed. The new government vowed to keep fighting, but Paris itself was soon surrounded by German forces. The brutal siege lasted through a harsh winter, with Parisians reduced to eating zoo animals and rats as food ran low. German artillery bombarded the city, while its residents slowly starved. The humiliation peaked on January 18, 1871, when Bismarck arranged the proclamation of the German Empire in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, the very symbol of French royal power. King Wilhelm I of Prussia was crowned German Emperor, as French lands lay occupied around him. The message was clear: a new European order had emerged with Germany, not France, at its center. As the humiliating defeat of 1870 faded from memory, France began looking for new frontiers to restore wounded national pride. From the ashes of European loss, a new colonial ambition rose. Within just 3 decades, a nation that had lost territory at home would control an amazing 8.6% of the world's land surface. A transformation bringing both triumph and great human cost. The years between 1880 and 1910 saw an unmatched land grab called the Scramble for Africa. In the 1872, African nations controlled 90% of their own continent, with European powers holding only coastal areas. This balance shifted dramatically as European nations, driven by economic interests and imperial rivalry, carved up the continent. Explorers, missionaries and traders returned with reports of vast resources, fueling a frenzy of colonial acquisition. France systematically expanded across Africa, building a colonially stretched from the Mediterranean Sea to the Congo Basin and from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea. The conquest of Algeria, begun decades earlier in 1830, intensified during this period. The violence of this expansion was staggering. Historians estimate between 500,000 and 1 million Algerians died during the French conquest through war, massacres, disease and famine. Beyond Algeria, French colonial dreams spread rapidly. Tunisia became a French protectorate in 1818, much to Italy's frustration, as it had its own plans for the territory. Through the 1882 and 1892, France seized huge parts of West Africa, including modern Senegal, Mali, Niger and Chad. In Central Africa, lands like Gabon and Congo, French control, while Madagascar was taken in 1896. This imperial competition sometimes brought France into direct conflict with other European powers. The Fashod incident of 1898 nearly started war with Britain when both nations claimed the same territory along the Upper Nile. Finally, France withdrew its forces, quietly accepting British dominance in the region and highlighting the competitive nature of this imperial expansion. Conquest methods varied by region, but typically involved overwhelming military force. Many African groups, including the Ashanti Fulani and Twa, fought fiercely to keep independence, but were finally beaten by European weapons and tactics. Invading powers drew borders between colonies with little thought for existing ethnic groups and kingdoms, creating artificial lines that would later fuel regional conflicts. While Britain often unruled colonies indirectly through local authorities, France used a policy of assimilation, trying to turn colonial subjects into French people. This approach imposed French language education and legal systems on colonial populations, while presenting colonization as a civilizing mission, bringing progress to supposedly backward areas. The French Empire reached beyond Africa to Southeast Asia. France combined its holdings in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos into French Indochina by 1887. This vast colonial network gave France raw materials markets for manufactured goods and renewed international prestige. Yet behind the imperial facade lay brutal realities. Colonial authorities routinely used forced labor for infrastructure projects, imposed heavy taxes, and violently crushed any resistance. Indigenous cultures were systematically undermined, traditional leadership structures dismantled, and local economies restructured to benefit the mother country. While French colonial administrators built grand boulevards in Hanoi and Dhaka, the brutality of their rule was not met with passive acceptance. Beneath the surface of apparent control, strong resistance movements took shape across 3 continents, challenging what seemed unbreakable colonial domination. In Morocco, Abdel Krim emerged as one of the most successful resistance leaders against European imperialism. His organization of Berber tribes in northern Morocco led to the RIF Republic, an independent state existing from 1921 to 1926. The Republic delivered a shocking blow to Spain when RIF forces massacred Spanish troops at the Battle of Annual in 1921, showing indigenous forces could defeat modern European armies. This victory sent shock waves through colonial administrations across Africa. The French and Spanish response revealed the true face of colonial rule. They sent a combined force of 200,000 soldiers against the RIF Republic, a huge military commitment showing how seriously European powers viewed indigenous resistance. Similar patterns appeared with the ZI and Confederation of Berber tribes, which used effective guerrilla warfare against French forces, even getting support from Germany and Austria, Hungary during World War I. In Vietnam, resistance took a decisive turn on February 10, 1930, when Vietnamese soldiers serving in the French colonial army staged the Yen by mutiny backed by the Vietnam Corps and Ang Vien Coup d'etat. This uprising marked a critical shift from secret resistance to open military action. The mutiny aimed to spark quieter rebellion among the general population, revealing growing nationalist feelings that would eventually lead to full-scale war against French rule. Algeria's resistance continued despite decades of brutal French conquest. Small attacks on French military outposts and colonial infrastructure grew more common, hinting at the larger conflict that would erupt in 1954. The French response typically involved overwhelming military force, a strategy that temporarily crushed uprisings, but only deepened anti-colonial bitterness. In Madagascar, the Minalan, a rebellion of 1904 to 1905, combined anti-colonial feeling with traditional religious belief. French authorities responded with massive military operations that devastated local populations, creating martyrs and resistance stories passed down through generations. What made these resistance movements particularly threatening to colonial authorities was their ability to adapt. When armed rebellion proved costly, resistance changed into political and intellectual movement. The interwar years saw educated elites emerge in cities who organized political parties, published newspapers, and made demands for reform and self-determination. French colonial officials faced a paradox of their own making. The civilizing mission had created a class of educated colonial subjects who now used French ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity to challenge colonial rule itself. These intellectual leaders studied France's own revolutionary history and used it to highlight the hypocrisy of French colonial control. This shift of resistance from armed rebellion to political organization happened simultaneously across the French Empire. In Vietnam, Algeria, and Senegal, future revolutionary leaders were building political movements that would eventually tear apart the colonial system. What France failed to see was that military wins over armed rebellions did not mean political victory over the desire for self-determination. As political movements gained strength across French colonies, the distant thunder of European artillery suddenly turned colonial subjects from resistance fighters into conscripted soldiers. When World War I began in 1914, France faced a military crisis forcing it to rely heavily on its vast empire. The scale of colonial mobilization was unmatched. About 600,000 colonial troops were drawn into Europe's bloodbath, including 275,000 North Africans, 190,000 West Africans, and tens of thousands from Indochina, Madagascar, and other territories. These colonial soldiers, particularly the Tir Senegalese from West Africa, found themselves thrust into the worst conditions of modern warfare. French military planners deliberately used them as shock troops in the most dangerous frontline positions at battles like Verdun and the Somme, where they suffered casualty rates over 25%. Despite their sacrifice, these soldiers remained second-class participants in a war supposedly fought for liberty and civilization. Military mobilization reached beyond the battlefield. Over 220,000 colonial workers were brought to France to replace French laborers sent to the front. These men worked in factories, mines, and dockyards, creating an unprecedented flow from colonies to metropolitan France. For many, this was their first exposure to the mother country they had been taught to respect and experience, often showing the contradiction between France's high ideals and the reality of racial prejudice. Even as colonial subjects died on European battlefields, French authorities worked to maintain the illusion of imperial unity and purpose. In 1916, Paris hosted a colonial exhibition designed to showcase colonial contributions to the war effort. The exhibition presented a carefully crafted story of imperial solidarity, while reinforcing racial hierarchies through its portrayal of colonial peoples as exotic, primitive, and dependent on French guidance. The war turned colonial territories themselves into battlegrounds. In Africa, Allied forces, including colonial troops, fought to capture German colonies like Cameroon and Togo. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire's entry into the war and declaration of jihad created complex challenges for French authorities in Muslim North Africa, who feared religious solidarity might weaken military recruitment. This forced France to use elaborate policies that kept control while continuing to take manpower from these lands. For colonial subjects who survived the conflict, the war experience created a deep paradox. Men who had seen Europeans slaughter each other in unmatched numbers could no longer accept myths of Western superiority. Those who had fought alongside French soldiers expected recognition and rights matching their sacrifice. Instead, they returned to colonies where discrimination stayed entrenched and their contributions were quickly forgotten. The paradox reached France itself. While celebrations stressed the imperial family fighting together, colonial veterans returned with higher expectations that France either could not or would not meet. This disconnect planted seeds that would later grow into independence movements across the empire. The very men who had fought to preserve the French Empire had, through their exposure to European ideals and European weaknesses, begun to imagine a world beyond colonial rule. Those seeds of discontent, watered by colonial soldiers' blood on European battlefields, erupted into organized resistance movement across the French Empire. While the 1931 Paris Colonial Exhibition showed imperial glory to 8 million visitors, behind romanticized displays grew a storm of nationalist movements that would eventually tear the empire apart. The Paris-Peace Conference of 1919 became a pivotal moment in colonial history. Delegations from Vietnam, Algeria, and other territories came to Versailles with petitions for greater rights or independence inspired by President Wilson's principles of self-determination. Their hopes were quickly crushed as France, far from loosening its grip, tightened control over colonial possessions after the war. In Algeria, the formation of the Etoile Nord-Africaine in 1926 marked a watershed moment. Founded by Algerian workers in France, this organization boldly demanded complete independence decades before the eventual Algerian War. The movement gained ground partly because of France's broken promises to veterans who had fought for the motherland only to return home to continued discrimination. Vietnam saw similar developments with the rise of the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, VNQDD, in 1927. This revolutionary group led the Yen by mutiny of 1930, challenging French authority before being brutally suppressed. That same year, a young revolutionary named Hoc Ninh founded the Indochinese Communist Party, representing a new phase of resistance, combining nationalist hopes with Marxist ideology and international support. Economic hardship during the Great Depression further fueled colonial unrest. As unemployment rose and living conditions worsened, resources kept flowing from colonies to France. This economic exploitation grew harder to justify, especially as educated colonial subjects pointed out the contradiction between French Republican ideals and colonial practices. France made tentative moves toward reform, particularly during the Popular Front government, 1936 to 1938. The Bloom-Violte proposal sought to extend French citizenship to a select group of educated Algerians. However, its failure to pass the French Parliament only strengthened revolutionary feelings. The message was clear: meaningful change would not come through peaceful reform. This lesson was brutally reinforced in Tunisia during 1937 to 1938, when French authorities killed 122 activists demanding constitutional reform. The massacres showed the limits of peaceful protest and the colonial system's resistance to real change, pushing more activists toward revolutionary methods. Even as resistance grew, France tried to maintain the illusion of imperial harmony. The 1931 Paris Colonial Exhibition welcomed over 8 million visitors with elaborate pavilions, showing romanticized versions of colonial cultures. Behind these facades, colonial subjects were categorized, studied, and displayed like exotic specimens, reinforcing racial hierarchies while masking rising unrest. As the decade ended, the contradictions of France's colonial project grew clearer. The empire preached liberty while denying freedom, promised equality while enforcing racial hierarchies, and claimed brotherhood while meeting demands for rights with violence. These contradictions would become impossible to maintain after World War II, but their seeds were firmly planted in the interwar years. The collapse of France in May to June 1940 shattered the illusion of European invincibility across its colonial empire. As German tanks rolled through Paris, the French colonial system, built on the myth of French military superiority, faced an existential crisis. How could colonial subjects continue to respect and fear a power that had surrendered in just 6 weeks? This question echoed from the markets of Dhaka to the rice paddies of Vietnam, fundamentally changing the relationship between France and its overseas lands. France's empire immediately split between competing loyalties. While the Vichy regime under Marshal Pétain kept control of much of North and West Africa, Indochina, and Madagascar, General Charles de Gaulle set up his Free French headquarters in London, declaring France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war. The colonial chess game began when Free French forces launched operations to take strategic territories like Cameroon, French Equatorial Africa, and Syria from Vichy control. Japan's expansion in Asia created more problems for French colonial authorities. In Indochina, the French colonial administration was forced into a humiliating arrangement keeping daily control while Japanese military forces occupied key positions and took resources. This arrangement lasted until March 9, 1945, when Japan executed a lightning coup disarming French garrisons and jailing colonial officials. This power vacuum gave the perfect chance for Vietnamese nationalists under Ho Chi Minh to organize and prepare for independence. The strategic importance of North Africa led to Operation Torch in November 1940, to when Anglo-American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria. The landings triggered complex reactions among colonial officials and local populations, with some Vichy forces resisting before switching loyalty to the Allies. For many North Africans, seeing powerful American forces arrive while France stayed occupied reinforced growing doubts about French claims of superiority. Colonial soldiers became essential to France's military revival. When de Gaulle needed to rebuild French forces after the Metropolitan Army's collapse, he turned to the Empire. The Free French Army that eventually helped free Europe was largely made of African soldiers. At Monte Cassino in Italy, North African and West African troops fought with distinction in some of the war's toughest mountain combat. During the liberation of Paris in August 1940, for colonial soldiers made about 65% of the French 2nd Armored Division that entered the city first, though many were quickly removed from the victory parade to present a whiter image of French liberation. While France celebrated victory in 1945, colonial subjects expected recognition and reward for their sacrifices. De Gaulle had convened the Brazzaville Conference in 1940, for where limited reforms were proposed for French Africa, but independence stayed explicitly off the table. The message was clear: France meant to keep its empire while offering only minimal concessions. This gap between expectations and reality fueled anti-colonial movements. In Madagascar, growing nationalist feeling erupted into open rebellion in March 1947. Anti-colonial fighters launched coordinated attacks against French military installations and European settlement. France's response was ruthless, sending reinforcements that used torture, summary executions, and forced resettlement. When the uprising was finally suppressed in 1948, between 30,000 and 80,000 Malagasy people had died. As France's colonial troubles mounted in Africa, its once prized possession in Indochina was slipping through its fingers. The battle that would finally break France's imperial spine was not fought in North African deserts or Madagascan jungles, but in a remote Vietnamese valley most French citizens could not even find on a map. World War II had fundamentally changed the colonial equation. When Japan surrendered in 1945, a power vacuum opened in Southeast Asia. Ho Chi Minh seized this moment to declare Vietnam's independence, reading a declaration directly inspired by America's own founding document. France, however, was determined to regain control over what it saw as a jewel of its empire, despite clear signs the colonial era was ending. The conflict that erupted in 1946 showed a profound military mismatch. France deployed modern weapons, aircraft, and professional soldiers, many just finished fighting Nazi Germany. The Viet Minh, meanwhile, started with a ragtag collection of old weapons and improvised explosives. What the Vietnamese lacked in military hardware, they made up for with superior knowledge of the land and overwhelming popular support. The war quickly settled into a devastating pattern. French forces held cities and major highways by day, while Viet Minh fighters ruled the countryside by night. Vietnamese guerrillas mastered the art of ambush, hitting isolated French outposts before fading back into jungle or nearby villages. French military planners badly misjudged the conflict's nature. They prepared for conventional war while facing what was essentially a people's revolution. By 1950, the Cold War had transformed the struggle, with communist China providing crucial weapons and training to the Viet Minh. After Mao Zedong's victory, Soviet advisors offered strategic guidance, turning a local independent movement into an international confrontation. The human cost mounted relentlessly. Colonial troops, including those from Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Senegal, bore the brunt of the fighting. These soldiers fighting to maintain a colonial system that also controlled their own homelands faced particular moral dilemma. Meanwhile, Vietnamese civilians endured bombings for 3 locations and food shortages as the war devastated their land. By 1953, French public opinion had soured on what increasingly seemed an unwinnable war. Military leaders made a fateful decision, setting up a fortified base at Dien Bien Phu near the Laotian border to draw Vietnam forces into a conventional battle where superior French firepower could win. It proved a catastrophic miscalculation. General Vo Nguyen Giap, the brilliant military strategist leading Vietnam forces, surrounded the French position with artillery pieces French intelligence believed could not possibly be moved through mountainous jungle. More than 10,000 Vietnamese porters had manually hauled these heavy guns piece by piece across seemingly impassable terrain, assembling them in positions overlooking the French camp. When the assault began in March 1950, for the outcome was nearly certain. For 56 days, Vietnam forces pounded the French position, gradually overrunning defenses while cutting off air supply. On May 7th, the garrison surrendered with over 10,000 French soldiers marching into captivity. The psychological impact of the defeat echoed far beyond Vietnam. A European colonial power had been decisively beaten by an Asian independence movement, a result previously thought impossible by Western military planners. The Geneva Conference that followed temporarily split Vietnam at the 17th parallel, with elections scheduled to reunify the country in 1956. The same year, France surrendered at Dien Bien Phu. A new colonial crisis erupted across the Mediterranean. On November 1st, 1950, for the National Liberation Front fell in, launched coordinated attacks across Algeria, starting what would become France's most painful decolonization struggle. Unlike Vietnam, Algeria represented something fundamentally different in the French colonial mind. After 132 years of French rule, Algeria was not seen as a mere colony, but an integral part of France itself, divided into 3 French departments and represented in the National Assembly. What made Algeria unique was its complex demographic reality. Over 1 million European settlers, called Pieds Noirs, had built lives there for generations. Many families had lived in Algeria for decades, seeing it as their rightful home. This deep-rooted European presence created a situation unlike any other in France's crumbling empire. The French government's determination to keep Algeria French came not just from strategy or economics, but from the political impossibility of abandoning these French citizens. The conflict quickly escalated into extraordinary brutality on both sides. The FLN used guerrilla tactics, bombing cafes and public spaces used by Europeans while targeting Muslim Algerians they saw as collaborators. The French military response was equally harsh, deploying massive force and controversial counter-insurgency methods. Between 1954 and 1960, to about 300,000 Algerians and 25,000 French died in the fighting, though exact numbers are still disputed. The Battle of Algiers in 1956 to 1957 showed the conflict's intensity. When the FLN started a bombing campaign in Algiers' European quarter, French authorities gave extraordinary powers to the 10th Parachute Division under General Jacques Massu. They systematically sealed off the Kasbah, the city's Muslim quarter, using checkpoints, identity papers, and house-to-house searches to break the FLN network. This brutal urban counter-insurgency included widespread torture, disappearances, and summary executions. Though militarily successful, the methods caused lasting trauma and damaged France's international reputation. By 1958, the Algerian conflict had destabilized France itself. The Fourth Republic collapsed amid fears of a military coup, bringing World War II hero Charles de Gaulle back to power. At first unclear about his plans, de Gaulle promised to keep French Algeria while starting to see the inevitability of Algerian self-determination. This realization put him on a collision course with the PIDE's noisome parts of the military that had backed his return. The war's brutality only intensified. The French built electrified border barriers along the Tunisian and Moroccan frontiers to stop FLN fighters finding sanctuary. Meanwhile, the military moved over 2 million rural Algerians into regroupment centers to separate them from insurgents, creating miserable conditions that further alienated the population. The French deployed over 400,000 troops at the conflict, speak more than they had used in Indochina. By 1961, international pressure mounted against France. Newly independent African nations supported Algeria at the United Nations, while Cold War rivals exploited France's colonial struggles. More importantly, French public opinion had shifted. Conscripted soldiers returned with disturbing war accounts. Intellectuals like Jean-Paul Sartre denounced French actions, and public protests grew. In April 1961, four retired generals tried a military coup in Algeria, which de Gaulle crushed through a televised appeal to the nation. With Algeria's independence, France's centuries-long empire ended. Though bits of its overseas territories remained, the dream of a global French empire was over. The same nation that once ruled huge stretches of North America, Africa, the Caribbean and Indochina now found itself redefining its world role. In a bitter irony, many independence movements France had crushed were inspired by the very ideals of liberty, equality and fraternity that shaped France's own revolution. In later years, France shifted from empire to soft power, keeping influence through cultural, economic and military ties with former colonies. By the age of French colonial rule, the age of conquest, expansion and control was finished. France's journey from medieval kingdom to global empire and finally to modern republic has been one of ambition, conflict and reinvention. Its influence, once spread across continents, now endures through culture, diplomacy and legacy. And so this chapter of history slowly fades into the quiet flow of time. Some mysteries remain unanswered and some truths continue to shape our world. We have walked through the past together and learned what it can teach us. If you carry this knowledge forward with you through each day, then the echoes of history will never be lost. Thank you for listening. Until next time, let the past remain alive in your mind.